Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into a year that seemed ordinary on the surface, but beneath the calm, a web of secrets, disappearances, and unexplained phenomena was quietly taking shape. From frozen mountains in the Urals to the endless expanse of the South Atlantic, from rocket tests at Cape Canaveral to the glitz of Hollywood, lives were vanishing, truths were being silenced, and events that seemed unrelated were in fact connected by something far more dangerous than anyone imagined. Before we get into it, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, only if you genuinely love deep dive history and mysteries like this. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what you were doing when the year 1959 first caught your attention. I love seeing how far and wide these stories travel. Now, take a deep breath, let the noise of the world fade, and prepare yourself. Tonight, we're journeying across continents, oceans, and skies, tracing the invisible threads of 1959 and uncovering a mystery that was never meant to be seen. Imagine standing in the icy expanse of the Urals, where the snow stretches unbroken to the horizon and the wind howls like something alive. It's February 1959, and a group of hikers has set off into these mountains, unaware that what they are about to encounter will puzzle the world for decades. Their trail should have been routine, but soon it became a corridor into chaos. When the search parties arrived days later, they found bodies frozen in unnatural positions, some missing eyes, others missing tongues, injuries that defied logical explanation, and instruments that registered strange levels of radiation. Soviet scientists moved quickly to close the case, eager to classify the files, label it an accident, and move on. But rumors whispered of strange lights in the sky, seen in the nights before the tragedy, glowing, moving, inexplicable. They were reported hundreds of miles away, directly above a military testing zone, as if the mountains themselves were connected to something far larger, something no one was meant to witness. As the search party documented the scene, one investigator paused, tracing the lines on a map that linked the frozen slopes to a distant location in the South Atlantic. A circle drawn in secrecy suggested that what happened in the Urals might be a side effect of forces operating thousands of miles away, a silent, invisible hand reaching across the globe. The chill of the wind seemed to carry a warning. These threads are connected, and what you're about to uncover stretches far beyond what the eye can see. And so, our story begins in the snowbound silence of the Dyatlov Pass, where every footstep, every flicker of light, and every unexplained anomaly is a clue in a web that grows ever wider. From here, we'll move across oceans and skies, through planes that vanished, submarines that disappeared, and rockets that detonated in secret tests. Each event, each life, each flicker of light is a piece of the same hidden puzzle. A year of 1959 that the world never really saw, but one that continues to echo through time, whispering its secrets to anyone willing to listen. If you think the mountains hold mysteries, wait until you see what the oceans have been keeping. Stay close, because the threads we are about to follow are dangerous, intricate, and deadly. And the closer we get, the more the full picture begins to take shape. And remember, every shadow, every signal, every disappearance is connected. The Dyatlov Pass is only the beginning. The wind howled across the icy expanse of the Ural Mountains, a raw, biting current that clawed at the flesh and stripped warmth from the lungs in uneven, desperate gulps. Footprints, faint and quickly swallowed by the shifting snow, marked a journey that would never be completed, a path traced by 9 hikers who had ventured into the wilderness with confidence, experience, and an almost reckless sense of invincibility. But the mountains held secrets, and secrets in the Urals were merciless. They waited silently, indifferent to human ambition, until they struck. The first searchers reached the edge of the tree line under a pale winter sun, the horizon flat with snow and the occasional skeletal spire of frozen in rock. and what they found made them stop in disbelief. Tents torn from their stakes, clothing discarded haphazardly, shoes missing or left in pairs, and the first bodies, half buried in snow, posed in grotesque, unnatural arrangements. The scene suggested panic, but there was no sign of an attack, no evidence of struggle, only the eerie, incomprehensible choreography of disaster. For days, the search party retraced the hikers' steps, their boots crunching on brittle snow that seemed to resist their intrusion, their eyes straining against the glare. Each discovery was more baffling than the last. One body, face pale and contorted in terror, had no trace of its eyes. Another, his tongue missing, lay twisted beside a small fire that had burned without purpose, its embers long cold. Radiation readings taken by a cautious engineer revealed faint, inexplicable traces, just enough to unsettle even the most skeptical minds. The air was heavy with questions that had no answers, and every answer that seemed possible only deepened the mystery. The mountains themselves seemed complicit, hiding truths beneath layers of ice and shadow, waiting for investigators who would never fully understand what had transpired. Rumors traveled fast along the sparse communication lines of the nearby Soviet settlements. One of the first messages spoke of an unnatural event, though the words were carefully chosen and their meaning obscured by the official voice. Higher authorities moved quickly, dispatching military units to cordon off the area, to classify the findings, and to ensure that what had happened remained beyond the grasp of public knowledge. Files were sealed, photographs cataloged and hidden, and the names of those involved were altered or suppressed in official communications. The urgency was palpable, almost frantic, as though those in charge feared not just discovery, but the very implication of what the bodies and their injuries suggested. It was not enough to find what happened. It had to disappear from memory as well, leaving behind only whispers and a chilling void where certainty should have been. As the searchers continued, strange reports began to emerge, initially dismissed as hallucinations or the result of hypothermia-induced delirium. Lights in the sky, hovering, moving with an intelligence that defied comprehension, were spotted in the nights leading up to the disaster. Some witnesses spoke of orbs glowing and shifting in colors that had no name, while others swore they saw patterns in the illumination, sequences that suggested observation rather than random occurrence. The accounts were inconsistent, yet persistent, echoing from one settlement to another, carried by those whose lives had brushed against the mountains and survived to tell the tale. They were the first hints of a greater, more complex tapestry, threads that stretched far beyond the frozen valley and into the broader arena of a world in the shadow of secrecy and fear. One officer, responsible for coordinating the military response, documented these anomalies in a small, leather-bound journal. His notes were cautious, deliberate, hinting at an awareness that something was profoundly wrong, but constrained by the fear of authority and the weight of his duty. "If this information is leaked," he wrote, "the implications could destabilize far more than local morale. What we have observed here, it is not meant for the eyes of the public." The words, almost mundane in tone, carried the tremor of terror beneath the surface. He was aware that forces, whether natural, technological, or human, had left their mark in ways that could never be fully explained, and that acknowledgement of these forces risked unraveling narratives painstakingly constructed by those in power. Investigators debated among themselves in hushed voices, the crackle of fire and the whistling wind filling the silence between arguments. Some posited that an avalanche triggered by unseen conditions could account for the chaos. Others, noting the unusual injuries and radiation traces, suggested experiments gone awry or even military testing in nearby regions. A young engineer, pale and shaking, whispered of sightings from villagers days prior, lights that hovered and danced above the mountains, aligning unnervingly with patterns in the snow where the hikers would later perish. His colleagues listened, skeptical but disturbed, each weighing the credibility of what their eyes had not seen against the mounting, undeniable anomalies. Outside, The mountains held their breath. Snow fell in silent sheets, erasing footprints and footprints alike, obliterating the trace of the living as it slowly claimed the story of the dead. The survivors of the search party, weary and hollow-eyed, began to notice that even as they recorded and documented, something eluded them, a logic, a sequence, a presence that was neither human nor fully comprehensible. One member, a veteran of prior expeditions, spoke rarely, his voice roughened by cold and fear. "It watches," he said once, barely audible, "and it waits. We only see what it allows." The words sank into the group unchallenged, because no argument could dismiss the sinking sensation of being observed, of being part of a narrative whose authorship they did not understand. The official reports that would later be filed contained meticulous detail, but only the sanitized elements, the physical evidence of death, the statistical analysis of the missing, were permitted to circulate. References to the lights, the radiation, the injuries that made no sense were excised or altered. The true horror of the Dyatlov Pass incident was buried under layers of bureaucratic precision, leaving behind only the skeletal bones of a story too dangerous to tell in full. And yet, those who were there, those who touched the ice, lifted the tents, and confronted the empty mountainside, carried fragments. Fragments that hinted at something greater, a reach of human or non-human intervention beyond comprehension. As the last searchers packed their equipment, ready to descend from the mountains that had become a tomb, a small radio transmission crackled to life in the distance. The voice was hurried, clipped, and almost mechanical. Coordinates logged, observation confirmed, proceed with protocol. Then, nothing. Static swallowed the sound, leaving only the wind and the snow, the mountains unmoved, indifferent, eternal. No one could identify the speaker, and no one would ever know precisely what protocol had been enacted, but the words were a chill, a punctuation to the already impossible scene. The thought lingered. The mountains did not kill the hikers. Something else did, something hidden, moving invisibly, and the mountains were merely the stage. Weeks later, when the official investigation concluded, a grainy, declassified map circulated among the highest levels of command. Circles were drawn in faint ink, one around the Dyatlov site and another thousands of miles away in the South Atlantic. No explanation was given. Those who saw it understood the implication. Events separated by geography, by thousands of miles, could be linked by forces or operations beyond public comprehension. The lights in the sky, the radiation, the incomprehensible injuries. They were threads in a greater design, a web whose full shape no mortal could yet perceive. And somewhere, far from the mountains, someone or something waited for the next move. A single observer hidden in shadows, marking the passage of events with cold precision. The story of the Dyatlov Pass would be told, but never the truth. The winds continued to howl across the peaks, and the snow covered the tracks of both the living and the dead, preserving the enigma for decades to come, a silent reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved. As the mind drifts from the frozen peaks of the Urals to the endless darkness of the South Atlantic, a single thought lingers, whispering through the silence. If these threads are connected, what else in 1959 was being orchestrated beyond the world's sight? In imagination, the map flickers, lines stretching from icy mountains to distant oceans, hinting at a hidden web already in motion, silent, vast, and far more dangerous than anyone realizes. The day had begun with a cold, brittle clarity, the kind that makes every sound snap and echo, as if the world itself is listening, waiting. In the quiet of the airport lounge, the laughter of young men carried an unspoken vitality, the exhilaration of success, and the restless hunger of youth. Buddy Holly, his guitar case leaning against the wall, moved through the space with an easy charm, nodding to faces he recognized, exchanging brief words with the rhythm of someone who had learned to move through the world lightly while carrying its weight in private. Richie Valens, his excitement tempered by a seriousness that belied his 18 years, lingered near the phone booth, glancing down at the dial tone, as if weighing the possibility of calling someone he feared he might never reach again. Giles Perry Big Bopper Richardson, his jovial energy filling the air like static electricity, laughed at some private joke, oblivious to the subtle tension curling through the room, invisible to all but those attuned to the currents of fate. The plane that would carry them into history waited on the tarmac, a Beechcraft Bonanza, small, unassuming, ordinary in appearance, yet destined to become a monument to the inexplicable fragility of life. Pilots and crew performed their checks with methodical precision, but even the best intentions and strictest procedures could not alter the invisible forces in motion. The weather reports had been mixed. Some stations predicted calm, others warned of icing conditions, but official explanations would later reduce these warnings to nothing more than minor turbulence. None of the young musicians, focused on their tours and the dizzying pace of a world that adored them, noticed the subtle anomalies: a radio crackle out of sequence, a barometer that fluctuated beyond standard margins, a shift in the hum of the engine that could not yet be named. Before boarding, Richie Valens had made one final call, the corded phone offering an intimacy lost to time, a connection that would soon vanish into static and secrecy. "I've got to meet someone in Chicago," he said, his voice low and careful, almost as though speaking too loudly might summon trouble. "A government man. It's important. I can't explain over the phone, but I'll tell you later." There was hesitation in his words, a rhythm that betrayed both trust and fear. The person on the other end promised to wait, to safeguard the information, and Valens hung up with a mixture of resolve and apprehension that would echo in the minds of those who later studied the fragments of his life. The flight lifted into the sky with the ease of routine, engines humming, wings slicing through the brisk northern air. Moments of serene calm masked the undercurrents of anomaly. Weather patterns that had been predicted with certainty diverged in ways subtle yet significant. Icing, forming in patches that confounded the calculations of even the most experienced pilots. Radio transmissions carried hints of static anomalies, coded in frequencies rarely used, unnoticed by anyone but the most trained ears. As the plane climbed, a distant observer, sitting in a communication station miles away, noted irregular signals overlaying standard aviation frequencies, traces of conversation in Russian that suggested distant monitoring, interest, or interference. On board, the musicians joked, laughed, and recited lyrics to one another, the innocence of youth shielded against the imperceptible shadows encroaching from the periphery of reality. Buddy Holly, ever attentive, felt a moment of unease as he ran a hand over the fuselage of his guitar case, imagining it as a talisman against the chaos around him. He shook the feeling off, blaming fatigue, the relentless pace of performances, the continuous travel that left a subtle tremor in the mind. Big Bopper, sensing the tension in the young Valens, clapped him on the shoulder, speaking in that booming, cheerful cadence that seemed to ward off any thought of doom. "Don't worry, kid. We'll make it there. Smooth skies ahead." And for a moment, hope seemed to settle like a fleeting warmth in the cabin. Then the anomalies grew tangible. The engine shuddered, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a tremor in the bones of the plane that suggested neither normal wear nor human error. Ice began to form along the wings, precise in places that should have remained unaffected. The instruments fluctuated, sometimes skipping values, sometimes aligning with predictions, sometimes betraying the laws of aerodynamics themselves. The pilots attempted to adjust, communicating with ground stations to reconcile readings, unaware that some of the messages they received were already compromised, intercepted, perhaps even fabricated to obscure the truth. Minutes stretched, each second elongated by the mind's perception under stress, until the plane reached a moment beyond the capacity of explanation. A sudden, violent vibration shook the fuselage, throwing instruments from their calibration and rattling the passengers with the blunt force of inevitability. A metallic smell filled the cabin, and the subtle, almost imperceptible hum of interference became a low, menacing drone that pressed against the ears, a vibration of presence that seemed external, intentional, watching. Valens clutched his seat, instinctively understanding the fragility of the moment, whispering to himself, "It's too quiet, too still up here. Something's wrong." At that moment, ground control logged discrepancies in the flight path, noting deviations that should have been impossible given the aircraft's controls and weather conditions. Maintenance logs, later reviewed in painstaking detail, revealed that crucial pre-flight checks had been completed, yet anomalies were present in the very systems verified as operational. Engine performance data contradicted manual readings. Navigational equipment appeared untouched, yet failed to respond correctly. And somewhere in the intricate lattice of Cold War monitoring, intelligence analysts noted a curious coincidence. The passenger list included an individual who had been linked to another mysterious flight, one involving unexplained disappearances in the Northern Pacific, recorded just months prior. The musicians, oblivious to the far-reaching implications, felt only the immediate reality, the shudder, the cold, the almost imperceptible lurch of the cabin, as if the air itself had grown heavier. Buddy Holly's mind, ever calculating, flickered between self-preservation and the unspoken dread that seeped from the collective subconscious of those in the plane. Big Bopper attempted to joke again, but the words fell flat, swallowed by the oppressive weight of imminent catastrophe. Valens' thoughts returned in fragments to his last phone call, to the mysterious government man in Chicago, to the unknown purpose of that meeting, and to a sense that unseen forces were converging, aligning events in a pattern that he could neither see nor escape. Then the final, unanswerable moments arrived. Reports would later indicate that the plane's descent was rapid, chaotic, almost surreal in its deviation from known flight dynamics. Radio signals cut in and out, capturing fragments of conversations, nonsensical exchanges, tones of panic and confusion. Some communications appeared to echo, distorted in ways that suggested interference beyond ordinary atmospheric conditions. One voice, speaking in rapid Russian, murmured technical phrases that hinted at monitoring, at manipulation, at a presence orchestrating events from afar. And then silence, sudden, absolute, unbroken, leaving only the cold, indifferent air and the vast, empty sky. Recovery teams arriving at the crash site were met with devastation that defied comprehension. The wreckage was scattered, fragmented in patterns that did not correspond to simple mechanical failure. Bodies showed injuries inconsistent with a mere impact, bruising and fractures that suggested sudden, violent forces applied in ways that ordinary physics could not easily explain. Personal effects were missing or displaced. Flight records and charts were partially destroyed, some pages appearing scorched or deliberately removed. Investigators at the time recorded a note. Cause, undetermined. Conditions suggest possible turbulence. Officially, the disaster was attributed to bad weather, icing, and pilot error. The words were technically accurate, yet empty, hollow, concealing a reality far more complex, far more deliberate. In the weeks following, those piecing together the fragments of the flight began to notice patterns that defied coincidence. Valens' final call, initially dismissed as ordinary, was cross-referenced with intelligence files, noting a missing passenger from another Cold War flight incident. The overlap was too precise, the timing too exact to ignore. Analysts whispered of secret meetings, of exchanges that must have occurred without public knowledge, and of forces operating above the mundane perception of ordinary humans. Each new detail was a thread in a larger tapestry, a web that hinted at orchestration beyond the visible, a network of intentions and interventions that remained invisible to the public eye. The U.S. Navy, monitoring communications in the northern regions during the same week, intercepted transmissions that were coded, irregular, unmistakably originating from Soviet stations positioned near the flight's final trajectory. Frequencies overlapped with known military bands, yet carried patterns inconsistent with standard protocols. Analysts reviewing these logs would later describe them as concerning, suggestive of surveillance or interference, an assessment that hinted at the hidden dynamics at play. Whether these transmissions influenced the crash or merely recorded it remains uncertain. What is clear is that the same week, signals traced across the North American continent and into the Atlantic suggested attention, observation, and perhaps a silent presence, tracking every move, every decision, every heartbeat aboard that doomed aircraft. And so, the narrative of the crash, celebrated and mourned in the public imagination as the tragic day the music died, carried beneath it currents of secrecy, interference, and unanswered questions. Each laugh, each chord strummed, each voice singing into microphones in distant halls became a ghostly prelude to events orchestrated outside perception, outside control, leaving only the raw impact of absence and the lingering sense that the lives lost were entangled in patterns far beyond their understanding. The music ended, but the threads of unseen forces, monitoring, and manipulation stretched beyond the wreckage, connecting in ways yet to be revealed. By the close of that fateful week, investigators and intelligence officers alike felt the weight of an unsettling realization. These were not isolated events. The crash, the interference, the anomalous contacts, the missing passengers from prior incidents, they were part of something larger, something deliberate, something that defied explanation yet demanded recognition. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, across the frozen expanses of mountains and the bustling corridors of cities, a hidden web moved silently, its influence imperceptible yet absolute. And in that web, the echoes of music, life, and unanswered questions lingered, waiting for the next revelation, the next connection to emerge from the shadowed labyrinth of 1959. The week closed not with closure, but with a lingering, cold apprehension. As analysts pored over intercepts, maps, and flight data, the realization crystallized. The crash was not merely a tragic accident, not merely a consequence of weather or mechanical failure. Something had intersected with the ordinary flow of events, touching lives, altering trajectories, leaving signals and consequences in its wake. And somewhere, in the complex lattice of human and non-human observation, the threads connected. The music had died, but the pattern had only begun to reveal itself. A subtle prelude to a year of shadows, secrets, and forces moving unseen across continents and oceans. A web that would soon entangle more than just a plane and its passengers. Even as the crash site is sealed and investigators turn away, one voice quietly recalls a last phone call mentioning a meeting with a government man. The mind traces the line to the southern oceans, where signals flicker on Navy screens. If coincidence has led here, then somewhere, something, or someone is listening, and the next revelation may light the sky in ways no one expects. The South Atlantic stretched like an endless slate beneath the January sky, cold, indifferent, and silent, except for the low hum of engines aboard the ships that had been deployed for Operation Argus. The men on board spoke little, their conversations measured, clipped by habit and discipline, though beneath the surface ran currents of unease that even the most stoic could not suppress. High above them, in the stratosphere, devices that no public record would ever fully acknowledge were being prepared for detonation, instruments designed to release energy so immense that the very air would shimmer with its invisible pulse. There was a methodical rhythm to their work, the precision of drills, checks, and confirmations, yet every man felt it, a presence beyond protocol, an anticipation of consequences that could not yet be calculated. One of the youngest communications officers, a man whose hands trembled despite years at sea, murmured quietly as he pored over instrument readings. These anomalies, they don't make sense. The gauges fluctuate even when everything is stable. His colleague, a veteran accustomed to the vagaries of the ocean, shrugged, trying to mask his own growing concern. It's the altitude, son. These instruments weren't built for this layer of the atmosphere. Nothing is precise up here. But the tremor in his voice betrayed a deeper fear, a knowledge that something unseen was already affecting their calculations, bending reality in ways beyond engineering. As the first detonations were initiated, the men aboard the vessels felt a pressure in their chests, a low vibration that resonated through metal and bone alike. Instruments went haywire, compasses spun without reason, radios emitted bursts of static so violent they pierced the ears, and cameras meant to record the tests failed inexplicably. One report noted, observed equipment failure at 12:43 GMT, all backup systems compromised, electromagnetic interference exceeding expected parameters. They attempted to dismiss it, attributing malfunctions to mechanical error, yet the pattern repeated with unnerving consistency. Each subsequent detonation revealed the same phenomenon, subtle at first, but cumulative in its effect. From the bridge, a lookout reported movement on the horizon, the silhouettes of ships, small but unmistakably Soviet, cutting across international waters with a quiet but deliberate intent. Orders were issued to track them, to record their course and speed. Yet, no one aboard truly understood why the ships were there, what they might be observing, or whether they were participating in some larger, unseen scheme. The presence of these vessels, silent watchers on the periphery, introduced a new layer of tension, a reminder that every action, no matter how secret, was now part of a global theater of power, fear, and observation. Below deck, engineers labored to calibrate instruments, the low hum of generators mixing with the distant roar of the ocean. They spoke in technical language, yet their words carried undertones of unease. Radiation levels are inconsistent, one noted, glancing at a gauge that oscillated wildly. This doesn't align with detonation data. Another leaned over, reading the same figures, whispering, "What if we're not just testing physics? What if there's something else up there? Something that reacts?" The silence that followed was heavier than any roar from the engines. None dared to voice what they all feared, the idea that they were conducting an experiment against a phenomenon that was not fully understood, a presence that might be observing them as much as they were observing it. Back on land, intelligence analysts pored over the telemetry, noting the anomalies with growing alarm. Electromagnetic pulses radiated far beyond the expected fallout zones, affecting communications thousands of miles away. Odd readings had been recorded near the northern hemisphere, near areas that would later be associated with unexplained incidents. Dyatlov Pass, in particular, showed residual radiation that did not conform to known natural sources or fallout trajectories. Experts convened in hushed rooms, debating the possibility that the high-altitude detonations were not merely scientific experiments or political signaling, but were intersecting with natural or unknown phenomena in ways that were unprecedented. The men at sea continued their work with mechanical precision, yet their diaries and reports, partially declassified decades later, reveal the human toll of the tension. Sleep was shallow, punctuated by the low hum and the intermittent flashes of light as instruments failed or spiked unexpectedly. Crew members described sensations of pressure in the chest, headaches, and a vague, pervasive disorientation that could not be attributed solely to fatigue. One officer noted, "It is as if the air itself resists comprehension. The higher we go, the more the rules we trust bend." Another recorded, "Somewhere beyond sight, something reacts to our presence, or perhaps to what we release. I do not know which." Meanwhile, scattered around the globe, Soviet intelligence noted the detonations with silent interest. Reports from reconnaissance ships and satellite technology, primitive yet capable, recorded the flash, the pulsing electromagnetic patterns, the disturbances that traveled far beyond the test site. Analysts debated the implications in whispered meetings. Were these tests a threat, a show of force, or an experiment touching on atmospheric or cosmic phenomena that remained hidden from public understanding? The subtle linkages between these tests and distant incidents, strange lights, unexplained energy bursts, radiation anomalies, began to emerge in private files, though no public acknowledgement was ever made. As the detonations continued, a subtle pattern emerged. The pulses of energy, recorded in electromagnetic grids, appeared to align with certain spatial coordinates, trajectories that coincided curiously with previous unexplained events. Dyatlov Pass, the Northern Pacific anomalies, and other incidents seemed, in retrospect, to exist along a lattice that the Argus tests intersected. The men aboard the vessels were unaware of this, their focus entirely on immediate procedure. Yet, the implications stretched across continents and latitudes, weaving a network of cause and effect that even the designers of the tests could not fully comprehend. Speculation began to circulate in classified channels. Argus was not purely scientific. Some suggested that the detonations were aimed not merely at understanding nuclear effects or testing military capabilities, but were designed to interact with something observed in the upper atmosphere, an anomaly or presence that had been detected, measured, and deemed a potential target. Some analysts whispered that the radiation spikes recorded near the Ural Mountains were not incidental, that the Dyatlov incident might be a direct consequence of interactions with these high-altitude experiments. The suggestion was alarming, almost unthinkable, that forces meant to test physics had inadvertently, or perhaps intentionally, intersected with events thousands of miles away, causing deaths and anomalies that defied conventional understanding. Back on the ships, the crew recorded every detail they could, unaware that their meticulous documentation would decades later suggest an invisible hand guiding not just outcomes, but interpretations. Logs noted strange shifts in compass readings, bursts of static that seemed almost like communication rather than interference, and a pervasive sense of being observed, though by what and by whom was impossible to discern. One sailor, in a later interview, recalled the feeling of looking into the sky at night and sensing that the stars themselves were no longer distant, that they carried an intelligence that scrutinized their every move. As the final tests of Operation Argus were concluded, the data collected revealed anomalies too profound to dismiss. Patterns of electromagnetic disturbance, correlations with prior incidents, and the inexplicable radiation footprints were compiled into reports that were immediately classified. These documents, decades later, would show that the military understood the potential implications, the possibility that events like Dyatlov Pass were not merely tragic accidents, but side effects of experiments touching on unknown atmospheric phenomena. The implications were staggering, suggesting a world where human technology and the natural or possibly non-human environment intersected in ways that were dangerous, unpredictable, and beyond comprehension. A final declassified memo, brief yet chilling in its wording, stated simply, "The Urals incident may be a side effect." The words hung in secrecy, a thread connecting thousands of miles, invisible to public scrutiny, yet indicative of a reality where actions in one part of the world could have consequences in another, consequences so subtle that they appeared as accidents or anomalies to ordinary observation. Men who had devoted their lives to precision, calculation, and the predictability of science were left with only the unsteady knowledge that some forces could not be controlled, that human intervention intersected with unknown phenomena in ways that might never be fully understood, and that the events of 1959 were only the beginning of a larger pattern, one that stretched across oceans, mountains, and the fragile air between earth and sky. The men aboard the vessels, returning to ports and reporting to superiors, carried their memories like ballast, a mixture of pride, fear, and unarticulated understanding. Some would later recount the strange hum in the air, the invisible pulse that seemed to ripple through the atmosphere, and the uncanny coincidence of other global events, moments that, in isolation, seemed random but in totality formed a lattice of silent cause and effect. They never spoke of it openly, but the weight of recognition lingered. They had been part of something extraordinary, something that touched lives far beyond their immediate comprehension. And somewhere in classified files, in rooms shielded from scrutiny, analysts pieced together the faint connections between Argus, Dyatlov, the Northern Pacific anomalies, and other inexplicable events. Lines traced across maps, plotted coordinates, radiation readings, and cryptic reports from those who witnessed phenomena too subtle or too extraordinary to record publicly. Each line suggested observation, intervention, and perhaps a deliberate hand guiding the unfolding pattern. The world of 1959, in its cold expanse and bustling cities, was unaware that invisible currents ran across the planet, intersecting lives, technologies, and tragedies with precision that was impossible to detect, and yet undeniable in hindsight. The operations concluded, the vessels dispersed, and the men returned to ordinary routines. But the echoes of Argus persisted in ways they could neither articulate nor fully perceive. Instruments continued to show residual anomalies. Telemetry suggested pulses of energy still reverberated in patterns that aligned with the locations of previous incidents. Analysts writing reports in dimly lit offices whispered of a possibility that was at once terrifying and almost impossible, that the high-altitude detonations had touched something unknown, something reactive, and that the consequences were already playing out in scattered corners of the globe. The silent watchers, whatever their identity or origin, were patient. They recorded, they observed, they calculated, and in doing so connected the Dyatlov Pass incident, distant unexplained phenomena, and even the music that had died earlier in the year into a tapestry that only the highest levels of intelligence would perceive, and even then, only partially. The lattice was invisible to the public eye, yet every action, every anomaly, every death or misfortune, every whisper of electromagnetic interference was a node within it. As Operation Argus faded into the classified history of the Cold War, the full scope of its consequences remained hidden. Files would remain sealed, testimonies buried, and explanations reduced to scientific or accidental inevitabilities. Yet, the anomalies persisted, silently asserting the existence of patterns beyond ordinary understanding. Across oceans, in mountains, and above the Earth itself, forces moved unseen, intersecting with human endeavor, leaving traces in the form of radiation spikes, unexplained deaths, anomalous signals, and whispers of events that seemed to defy cause and effect. The memo linking the Urals to the tests was brief, clinical, and chilling, a single line of typed words connecting two tragedies separated by thousands of miles. It implied causation, but in the careful language of bureaucratic caution, it suggested uncertainty, leaving the reader with only the possibility of a side effect, a ripple in reality caused by the intersection of human experimentation and phenomena beyond comprehension. The men who had participated in Argus, the analysts who recorded and interpreted, and the intelligence officers who reviewed the reports were left with the unsettling realization that the world was more interconnected, more vulnerable, and more mysterious than anyone had dared to imagine. The sky over the South Atlantic returned to silence after the tests, yet the pulse of energy lingered invisibly, moving across latitudes and longitudes, intersecting with lives and landscapes thousands of miles away. Somewhere, across frozen peaks and icy valleys, in quiet northern villages and distant capitals, the reverberations of those detonations would touch lives in ways subtle, tragic, and inexplicable. And in the offices where intelligence analysts compiled these threads, the lattice began to emerge, a network of cause and effect stretching across the globe, connecting mountains, oceans, and the thin line between human knowledge and forces beyond comprehension. A network whose full shape would remain a secret for decades, waiting for those patient enough to follow its threads. The glowing arcs above the South Atlantic fade from consciousness, leaving only the echo of a memo. The Urals incident may be a side effect. Yet as the waves ripple across the ocean, imagination carries a vessel drifting, abandoned, silent, the MV Joyita, and a single question forms: whose hands guided this ghost ship, and to what hidden purpose? The Pacific stretched endlessly, a vast, indifferent expanse that swallowed time and erased footprints without thought or mercy. In late October of 1959, the MV Joyita was discovered drifting near the remote reefs of the South Pacific, a vessel that seemed to have been spat from one reality into another, empty yet perfectly afloat, carrying with it the residue of something inexplicable. Fishermen, the first to stumble across its silent hull, approached cautiously, their boats creaking and oars slicing through the dark water as though the sea itself whispered warnings. There was a chill in the night air, unusual for the tropics, a heaviness that pressed against skin and muscle, making each movement deliberate, almost unnatural. As they neared, they saw no sign of life. No shadowed figure peered from the portholes. No light glimmered in the hold, only the subtle swell of the ocean beneath the timbers and the low, constant sigh of wind across the decks. When boarding was finally attempted, the scene inside was confounding. Supplies lay untouched, some starting to rot, giving off a faint, pungent odor that mingled with the salt and oil. Personal belongings of the crew, charts, journals, clothing, remained in place as though the ship had been frozen in time, yet there was an absence so complete, so total, it felt as if the air itself had been evacuated of the people who had once occupied it. The galley still had plates stacked, utensils aligned neatly, and food left to spoil as if by a conscious decision to abandon it in suspended animation rather than disorder. The officers' quarters were intact, charts pinned and organized, cabins locked, yet no one responded to calls, no one answered the urgent knocks, no footsteps echoed across the decks. It was a ghost ship in the truest sense, carrying the uncanny weight of absence, a space haunted not by specters, but by the eerie punctuation of missing lives. Among the first to be inspected were the navigational and radio systems, the veins through which a ship communicated with the world. Here, anomalies leapt from the ordinary into the extraordinary. Compasses were shattered, readings inconsistent, and instruments that should have functioned under routine maintenance appeared smashed, twisted, yet in patterns that suggested precision rather than random damage. In the radio room, officers and later investigators discovered a piece of equipment that defied conventional classification. Its design was identical in layout to devices known only to have been deployed in Operation Argus. Faint inscriptions and calibration marks matched those found in declassified Navy files detailing high-altitude tests. For a brief, inexplicable moment, it seemed as if the vessel had become a silent courier, carrying technology from the South Atlantic tests to the remote Pacific without explanation, its presence a deliberate, orchestrated echo across thousands of miles. Eyewitnesses, fishermen whose lives had been bound to the whims of the ocean, offered accounts that would later be dismissed as superstition, but were recorded carefully in intelligence files. They spoke of a blinding flash in the night sky, sudden and searing, like the world itself had split open, illuminating clouds, waves, and horizon alike before vanishing. Some swore it was a meteor, some claimed it was a fireball, yet all agreed the flash occurred moments before the Joyita was discovered adrift, a temporal link that no conventional explanation could satisfy. The men reported feeling disoriented afterward, a sense of vertigo, nausea, and a fleeting, unnameable dread, as though they had glimpsed something at the edge of perception, a presence or event outside the normal order of things. When the cargo hold was inspected, no conventional theft or plundering was evident. Supplies remained untouched, crates stacked precisely, yet the radio gear, matching that from Operation Argus, had been the only component removed or altered in any discernible way. The implication was subtle but profound. The vessel had become a bridge for equipment, perhaps even personnel, between the secretive U.S. experiments in the South Atlantic and an unknown entity somewhere across the Pacific expanse. Investigators, naval officers, and intelligence analysts began to connect threads that stretched beyond the ordinary. Anomalous radiation readings, unexplained absences, the prior week's tests in Operation Argus, and now a ghost ship appearing without explanation in a remote, strategic stretch of ocean. Each node suggested intent, design, and a level of orchestration invisible to the public eye. As teams examined the engineering diagrams embedded in the radio system, they noted an unsettling precision. The wiring, the calibration of the oscillators, the unique frequencies, all pointed to applications far beyond maritime communication. The design hinted at atmospheric monitoring, energy detection, and possible interference in ways only hinted at in top-secret military projects. It became increasingly plausible that the Joyita systems had been part of a handover, an exchange of technology between U.S. operatives and some unknown Pacific recipient, a silent transaction conducted under the guise of routine maritime operations. Files, once classified and now partially declassified, suggested patterns. The equipment found aboard had been adapted from high-altitude test gear and was designed to measure or manipulate energy patterns in the atmosphere, perhaps even to interact with phenomena that had earlier affected Dyatlov Pass or other northern incidents. The human element of the discovery added further tension. Investigators, scientists, and naval officers all noted an uneasy symmetry in the timing. The flash observed by the fishermen, the anomalous equipment, the proximity to strategic maritime routes, and the inexplicable disappearance of the crew created a psychological weight that could not be ignored. Some argued that fear or superstition colored their reports. Others insisted on strict adherence to documented evidence. Yet, even the most rational observers admitted a subtle, creeping sense of cognitive dissonance, as though the Joyita was a message encoded in absence, its silence speaking volumes about forces operating in the shadows. Connections to previous events continued to emerge. Telemetry from Operation Argus suggested that electromagnetic disturbances could propagate across the globe, interacting with both natural and artificial systems. Could these disturbances, combined with advanced radio equipment, have created conditions that influenced the fate of the Joyita and its crew? Analysts, working in secrecy, considered the possibility that the ship's abandonment was not merely a maritime accident or mutiny, but rather the side effect of intersecting experiments, some physical, some cognitive, some entirely unknown. The web of cause and effect, stretching from the South Atlantic to the Pacific, threaded through unseen hands and invisible patterns, leaving only artifacts, flashes of light, anomalous equipment, abandoned vessels, as proof of an operation whose scope no one could yet fully understand. Interviews with locals, the few who dared approach the vessel, added fragments to the narrative. They described hearing tones from the radio that were unrecognizable, a pulsing rhythm that seemed to respond to their proximity, patterns that were almost musical yet alien, harmonics beyond conventional comprehension. Attempts to log these transmissions yielded inconsistent results. Tapes and recorders malfunctioned in ways that paralleled the failures observed during Argus. Some suggested interference. Others whispered of consciousness, a reactive force in the atmosphere itself responding to the signals. Every observation, every anomaly, seemed to confirm one chilling possibility. The Joyita had become a node, a point of intersection between human technology, unexplained phenomena, and forces that operated invisibly across vast distances. Back in the intelligence offices, analysts plotted courses, tracing the ship's last known path against ocean currents, wind patterns, and known military activity. The trajectory did not align with standard maritime behavior, and yet the vessel remained remarkably intact, floating precisely along a line that suggested intention. It became increasingly plausible that the Joyita had been purposefully guided, whether through human intervention, technological means, or some combination of both. Declassified communications hinted at coordination, cryptic logs noting minor deviations in currents, and weather patterns that facilitated its drift, reinforcing the notion of an orchestrated transfer. The implications extended beyond maritime operations. The same radio systems discovered aboard the Joyita were later found to have applications in missile telemetry, tracking, and communication. Engineering blueprints, once secret, show design similarities with systems installed on Cape Canaveral rockets in the early 1960s, a direct line from the ghost ship to the burgeoning space program. The coincidence, or perhaps deliberate progression, suggested that the Pacific handover was more than a test. It was a functional bridge between atmospheric research, naval experimentation, and space-based intelligence operations. Patterns once dismissed as random or inconsequential were suddenly linked, forming a lattice of influence, observation, and interaction that spanned oceans, altitudes, and technological domains. The psychological weight of these revelations was not lost on the investigators. Diaries, internal memos, and witness testimonies reflected a subtle but pervasive dread, the realization that human perception was always lagging behind events, that technology, environment, and intention could converge in ways that erased the human element, leaving only artifacts and echoes. Every anomaly, the abandoned vessel, the blinding flash, the Argus equipment, suggested forces that had operated just beyond observation, shaping outcomes without leaving clear traces. It was a quiet horror, a tension that demanded comprehension yet resisted understanding. As the MV Joyita drifted, silent and enigmatic, the narrative thread connecting it to Operation Argus and prior incidents solidified. Analysts began to see the outlines of a pattern: high-altitude detonations, electromagnetic disturbances, anomalous radiation readings, sudden and unexplained disappearances, and technological handovers across vast distances. Each element reinforced the others, hinting at a deliberate design whose scope transcended ordinary military experimentation, pointing toward something far more enigmatic, almost conspiratorial in its precision. The discovery of the radio system aboard the Joyita, in particular, acted as a linchpin in the emerging narrative. When engineers compared its schematics with subsequent deployments in rocketry and atmospheric testing, the connections were undeniable. The same circuits, oscillators, and calibration patterns had been implemented in Cape Canaveral launches, linking the Pacific Ghost ship to the space program's earliest intelligence-gathering efforts. The implication was staggering. The Joyita had not simply been abandoned. It had served as a carrier, a handoff point, a node in a global network of technological and observational operations that was invisible to the public, yet meticulously orchestrated in secret. And as the ocean reclaimed its silence around the drifting vessel, the threads of the narrative extended outward: Dyatlov Pass, Operation Argus, unexplained phenomena in the Pacific, and the invisible currents of Cold War intelligence intersected in ways that defied conventional explanation. The Joyita, once a simple merchant vessel, had become a symbol, a proof point, a haunting reminder that the forces shaping events were not always visible, not always rational, and not always benign. The flash, the radio systems, the abandoned crew, all converged to suggest a reality that stretched beyond the immediate, beyond the tangible, connecting the sea, the sky, and human ambition in a lattice that was only beginning to be understood. The drifting radio echoes die away, replaced by a hum of distant machinery and rockets being readied. Somewhere, Cape Canaveral prepares, the same radio signals encoded into experimental vehicles. If the oceans have been a stage, the sky above Florida may soon reveal the next act in a performance that no one was meant to witness. The early morning at Cape Canaveral carried a deceptive serenity, the kind of calm that always preceded disaster in the Cold War's hidden theaters. Engineers arrived before dawn, the soft hum of distant machinery mixing with the briny tang of the Atlantic breeze, unaware that this day would be seared into memory, not for its successes, but for its shattering losses. The test rocket, scheduled for a routine launch, was a culmination of months of labor, calibration, and anticipation, representing the pinnacle of U.S. atmospheric and missile research. Its design drew upon lessons from naval guidance systems, including the most secretive developments aboard the USS Barbell, blending space-bound ambition with underwater precision. Yet, in the back of every mind, a shadow lingered, the silent anxiety that comes when you play with forces beyond ordinary reckoning. When rockets are both vehicles of exploration and weapons in the silent war for dominance. When ignition began, the roar of engines and the tremor of the launch pad seemed to stretch into eternity. Monitors flickered with telemetry, showing every pressure gauge, trajectory calculation, and fuel mix in meticulous detail. But then, something went horribly wrong. Mid-air, at the very edge of space, the rocket disintegrated in a violent flash, scattering debris across a swath of ocean and land. The engineers on site were thrown into chaos, some thrown physically by the blast's shockwave, others frozen in horror as monitors flashed impossible readings. Among the debris, investigators later found foreign-made components, parts not documented in any American schematic, their metallurgy and design unmistakably Soviet in origin. Whispers began almost immediately. Had a mole infiltrated the program, embedding themselves within the intricate lattice of space and naval research? Could someone have intentionally sabotaged the rocket to gather data, misdirect development, or simply cause catastrophe? The personal toll was immediate and brutal. Key engineers, men and women whose lives had been devoted to precise calculation and experimentation, were killed or grievously injured. Their notebooks, partially burned but still legible, revealed a meticulous attention to detail, annotations connecting missile trajectories to signals picked up in the South Atlantic, noting strange interference patterns that mirrored those observed in Operation Argus. Some pages contained diagrams of submarine guidance systems, with faint scribbles suggesting attempts to integrate atmospheric readings into the controls used on the USS Barbel. The overlap between the submarine guidance technology and the space-bound rocket systems hinted at a deeper connection, one that went beyond ordinary engineering, an intersection of naval secrets, atmospheric experimentation, and space exploration that had perhaps been compromised from within. Rumors of infiltration began to circulate among the surviving personnel, muttered in hushed corridors and whispered during late-night shifts over coffee that had gone cold. Soviet agents, spies embedded at high levels, were not an impossible abstraction. They had been detected before, leaving behind only subtle traces of influence, small anomalies in systems that would otherwise have functioned flawlessly. The debris from the explosion reinforced these fears, suggesting not only sabotage, but deliberate insertion of technology designed to mislead, confuse, or capture sensitive data. Each foreign-made component told a story, each fragment of circuitry a potential thread to a hidden hand operating in the shadows of the American space program. Investigators cross-referenced telemetry with prior incidents, noticing patterns that drew an invisible line between Cape Canaveral, the abandoned MV Joyita, and the high-altitude tests conducted during Operation Argus. There were repeated electromagnetic disturbances, unexplained fluctuations in signal strength, and bursts of energy recorded at odd intervals. Phenomena that suggested someone or something was tracking these experiments and perhaps even intervening. The implications were terrifying. A mole might have access to both spacebound and underwater platforms, bridging oceans and atmospheres to observe or manipulate events far beyond ordinary comprehension. The human and technological connections spanned continents, oceans, and layers of classified research, forming a lattice of vulnerability and exposure that threatened not just the projects themselves, but national security in ways the public could scarcely imagine. Amid the chaos, the surviving engineers attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events. Initial reports had been sanitized, reduced to a technical failure blamed on miscalculations or minor material defects. Yet, in internal documents, a far more complex story emerged. Notations indicated that interference had been detected in the rocket's guidance system at precise moments corresponding to the final trajectory. Signals unaccounted for by American instrumentation suggested either advanced Soviet monitoring or a completely unknown source manipulating the rocket's controls. Every calculation, every sensor reading, and every line of code was scrutinized, revealing patterns too precise to dismiss as coincidence. It seemed as though someone had anticipated each movement, each adjustment, creating a deadly chain of events that ended in destruction. One engineer, a mid-level officer who had previously worked on submarine guidance systems aboard the USS Barbel, noted an unsettling convergence. The same techniques used to navigate and control submarines in the deep Atlantic appeared adapted for atmospheric and spacebound platforms. The Barbel had operated in regions overlapping with Argus test zones, and some of its instrumentation mirrored the technology found aboard the MV Joyita. The realization dawned slowly, but with mounting dread. Someone had bridged naval and space research in a way that was exploitable, someone with intimate knowledge of both domains, capable of inserting foreign elements without detection. The network of expertise, trust, and classified oversight that these engineers had relied upon was suddenly exposed as potentially compromised from within. Intelligence reports compiled in the aftermath began to suggest a chilling hypothesis: a mole embedded across naval and space operations, watching trajectories, intercepting signals, and possibly influencing events to gather knowledge or steer research toward undisclosed ends. Debates in secure rooms speculated on motive, capability, and potential targets. Could this individual or group have orchestrated interference from afar, using technology embedded in rockets, ships, and radio systems to manipulate outcomes? Could the deaths of engineers at Cape Canaveral have been both a warning and a cover, a method of resetting the environment while removing those who might have detected the breach? The unanswered questions cast long shadows over the research community, eroding confidence and instilling a pervasive sense of paranoia that nothing was as secure as it seemed. Naval communication logs further complicated the narrative. At the exact moment of the rocket's destruction, the USS Barbel was recorded transmitting data from coordinates in the South Atlantic, the same region previously associated with Argus tests. The coincidence could not be ignored. Submarine guidance signals, spacebound telemetry, and the remnants of the Joyita's equipment converged in one region, suggesting a deliberate layering of technology, observation, and perhaps manipulation. Analysts began to wonder if the high-altitude detonations, the ghost ship, and now the destroyed rocket were components of a larger, more coordinated experiment, one that had been meticulously hidden from public awareness while intersecting with multiple branches of military and scientific endeavor. Amid the internal investigation, a telegram arrived that froze hearts and minds. Barbel overdue, last contact, South Atlantic coordinates. The words were stark, clinical, and chilling, implying a continuity of peril and uncertainty. The submarine, long associated with secrecy and silent operations beneath the ocean's surface, now became another node in a growing lattice of anomalies. The telemetry, the foreign-made parts, and the deaths of engineers all converged, revealing a pattern that transcended mere accidents. Each element suggested a deliberate hand, a network of espionage and technological intervention operating simultaneously across oceans and airspace. The human response to this mounting web of mystery was profound. Survivors of the Cape Canaveral incident were plagued by fear, suspicion, and grief, their sense of reality destabilized by the impossible combination of sabotage, technology, and invisible oversight. Diaries and post-event testimonies reveal moments of profound dread, engineers grappling with the sense that they had been instruments within a larger design, observers in a reality where their control was illusory and their expertise insufficient against a hidden intelligence. The psychological toll was immense, as those trained to solve problems with logic and precision faced a network of threats that obeyed no conventional rules. Across military and intelligence circles, speculation ran rampant. Who or what had access to both space and naval platforms, capable of inserting foreign components, manipulating guidance systems, and coordinating events over thousands of miles? Could a single mole account for the observed anomalies? Or was it a network, an embedded infrastructure that had grown quietly and invisibly within U.S. programs? Every investigation unearthed further questions. The anomalies recorded in the South Atlantic, the Joyita's ghostly presence, and the sequences leading to the deaths of engineers at Cape Canaveral seemed intricately linked, suggesting a scope of influence that was staggering in its reach. As the debris from the explosion was catalogued, detailed analysis of the foreign-made components revealed subtle yet significant differences from known Soviet technology. The metallurgy suggested an origin perhaps related to advanced clandestine programs, with capabilities designed for both data collection and interference. Oscillators and calibration elements mirrored aspects of previously secret experiments, hinting at cross-domain application across space, naval, and atmospheric systems. The presence of these components was a clarion signal that the scope of infiltration was not limited to a single incident or location, but rather part of a sophisticated, multi-layered operation. The implications of the Cape Canaveral disaster were further complicated by the timing of related events. Telemetry logs suggested the rocket's trajectory intersected, even briefly, with regions of atmospheric disturbance recorded during Operation Argus. Simultaneously, the Yoyita's location in the Pacific and the anomalous readings from the South Atlantic created a temporal and spatial lattice that hinted at an unseen orchestration. Analysts began to see patterns in the chaos, a map of converging anomalies, technological manipulation, and unexplained events that suggested deliberate planning rather than chance. The narrative was no longer simply about sabotage or accidental deaths. It was about a web of intervention stretching across continents, oceans, and altitudes, one that used both human and technological agents to achieve ends hidden from public view. The telegram marking the Barbel's disappearance added a palpable sense of urgency. The submarine's silence, combined with the destruction at Cape Canaveral and the lingering mysteries of the Yoyita, framed a narrative in which no operation, no matter how secret, was entirely safe from infiltration or interference. The lattice of events seemed to expand in real time, suggesting that every movement, submarine maneuvers, rocket launches, and radio transmissions, was potentially observed, manipulated, or anticipated by forces operating invisibly within and beyond the U.S. defense and scientific infrastructure. Investigators, analysts, and surviving engineers began to compile what would eventually be the foundation for decades of declassified files tracing technological links, anomalous readings, and unexplained disappearances. Every new data point reinforced the notion of a mole or network embedded in both space and naval research, capable of orchestrating interference across multiple domains simultaneously. The convergence of human tragedy, technological anomalies, and invisible orchestration left a lingering question. How deep did this infiltration run, and how many events in 1959 were already shaped by its hidden hand? As Cape Canaveral returned to routine operations, the memory of the destroyed rocket, the foreign-made components, and the missing submarine lingered like a low hum, an unacknowledged resonance across the corridors of power and science. Analysts continued to map patterns, connecting the Yoyita, Operation Argus, and the recent events to form a lattice of invisible influence stretching from the stratosphere to the ocean floor. The psychological and technological ramifications were profound. Engineers and intelligence officers alike realized that mastery of individual systems was insufficient when unseen forces could operate across platforms, distances, and domains beyond immediate comprehension. The cliffhanger poised the narrative for the next layer. The investigation now stretched from Cape Canaveral and the South Atlantic to the Arctic and beyond, suggesting that the same invisible forces, manipulating rockets, submarines, and ghost ships, could intersect with mysterious signals and phenomena recorded elsewhere in 1959. The web was widening, and the next revelation would continue to tie together the year's most enigmatic events into a single, terrifying lattice of mystery and espionage. The USS Barbel had departed its home port under the same routine calm that marked every naval mission: crews running drills, engines humming, sonar checks performed with practiced precision, and the faint aroma of diesel oil mixing with salt and sea spray. To outsiders, it was another submarine among many, a vessel of war and research designed to glide silently beneath the Atlantic, executing maneuvers calculated to remain unseen, unheard, and ultimately untraceable. Yet, on this particular mission, something extraordinary was quietly threading itself into the sequence of 1959's enigmatic events. The Barbel carried state-of-the-art diesel engines and guidance systems that were the envy of both allies and potential adversaries, the same technology previously implicated in the Cape Canaveral incident, tracing a line that stretched across oceans, altitudes, and unknown agendas. Days into its deployment, whispers began to surface, quiet murmurs first dismissed as overactive imaginations, the result of long hours beneath waves, the oppressive darkness of the deep, and the constant pressure of absolute silence required to operate effectively. Sailors reported unusual readings on sonar, fleeting blips that seemed to shimmer and then vanish, electrical anomalies that flickered and hummed in places where wires were thought carefully insulated, and a tension among the crew that was almost palpable, a low, continuous anxiety that none could explain. There were tales, quietly repeated in corridors and mess halls, of underwater lights appearing beneath the hull, glowing in colors that did not belong to the ocean, pulsating as though alive, then vanishing moments before anyone could approach. The reports grew more disturbing as the mission progressed. On the third day, an inexplicable shockwave rocked the Barbel while it was submerged near a sector of the South Atlantic roughly corresponding with the locations of the Operation Argus tests. The impact was brief but powerful, enough to jolt the crew, trigger emergency procedures, and produce fleeting but unsettling data anomalies. Equipment readings recorded transient spikes in radiation and electromagnetic interference, patterns eerily similar to those captured during high-altitude detonations months earlier. Some engineers aboard had once worked on similar devices on the Hoyita and Cape Canaveral rockets, and the convergence of signals, shockwave data, and prior anomalies was too precise to be dismissed as coincidence. Whispers began to call it an underwater detonation, an event deliberately hidden by official records, its origin unknown, its effects devastating in ways never fully disclosed. The human dimension added layers of tension and dread. Examination of the Barbel's crew manifest revealed one sailor whose identity caused a ripple of unacknowledged shock in the intelligence community. He was the brother of a victim from the Dyatlov Pass incident. The coincidence alone was staggering, but further investigation suggested that the connection was anything but random. Families were quietly pressured into silence by Navy intelligence, warnings that any public disclosure could jeopardize national security, compromise ongoing operations, or expose technological secrets tied to both submarine guidance and atmospheric research. The pattern of secrecy, enforced through subtle coercion, mirrored the silencing seen in the wake of Cape Canaveral, creating a sense that multiple nodes, rocket engineers, submarine crews, and civilians tangentially connected to unexplained events, were being quietly manipulated, restrained, or monitored. Sailors from other submarines operating nearby provided crucial testimony, the kind that would be buried in classified files for decades. One officer, later debriefed in isolation, described a luminous, ethereal glow beneath the water that preceded a sudden shock wave powerful enough to rattle their vessel, knock instruments offline, and induce a wave of nausea and disorientation among the crew. "It was like the ocean had eyes," he said, voice trembling long after the official records had been sanitized, "and whatever it saw, it decided we shouldn't be here." The lights, the shockwave, and the resulting data anomalies all pointed toward the South Atlantic, toward sectors where the Argus tests had been conducted and where debris from the Hoyita had been noted, reinforcing the sense of a lattice of unexplained intersecting phenomena spanning oceans and technology. The operational secrecy of the Barbel was compounded by the Navy's approach to investigation. Logs were partially redacted. Communications between the Barbel and command were heavily encrypted, and any post-event analysis was conducted under the strictest classification. Crew members who survived initial anomalies reported that the ship's instruments seemed to behave as though influenced by an unseen hand. Depth controls resisted commands. Sonar pings returned echoes inconsistent with natural or known man-made objects, and navigation systems intermittently aligned with points that bore no logical connection to the vessel's intended path. The unnerving consistency of these anomalies suggested a directed, intentional influence rather than mechanical failure, and the parallels to the prior month's events, Operation Argus, the Joyita, Cape Canaveral, could not be ignored. As the days wore on and the submarine remained unresponsive to scheduled communications, the broader intelligence community began tracing links between the Barbel, atmospheric phenomena, and the high-altitude nuclear tests. Analysts examined cross-domain data, comparing electromagnetic anomalies recorded in Argus with underwater disturbances along submarine routes. Patterns emerged suggesting that forces, either natural or engineered, were operating across mediums, exerting influence both beneath the waves and above them. The convergence of technological interference, missing personnel, and unexplained phenomena painted a picture of a Cold War theater extending beyond the usual geopolitical frame, hinting at hidden experiments, secretive operations, and potentially unknown adversaries leveraging technology in ways few could fully comprehend. The psychological weight on surviving personnel, both aboard other submarines and within intelligence units, was profound. Diaries and internal memos from the time reveal moments of existential dread. Trained engineers, sailors, and analysts confronted anomalies that defied conventional explanation, observing phenomena that made their most rigorous calculations meaningless. Anxiety spread through the ranks, amplified by secrecy and the subtle pressure to conform to official narratives. Personal accounts mentioned sleepless nights, intrusive thoughts, and a lingering unease that the ocean itself had become an active, unpredictable participant in events that were supposed to be strictly controlled. The disappearance of the Barbel created cascading operational challenges. Command structures were disrupted, missions delayed, and classified investigations proliferated in multiple overlapping departments. Analysts struggled to parse data that appeared contradictory, anomalies that seemed impossible, and witness testimonies that veered toward the surreal. Yet beneath the surface, the emerging pattern of intersections between Argus, the Joyita, Cape Canaveral, and now the submarine suggested coordination, or at least observation, by an intelligence presence operating invisibly across domains. The notion of a mole or network embedded within U.S. operations, capable of influencing both space and naval assets, gained credibility with every unexplainable event. The Navy, adhering to protocol yet facing escalating anomalies, issued coded instructions to maintain silence, contain knowledge, and manage familial inquiries. Pressure on relatives like the Dyatlov-linked sailors family reinforced the narrative that 1959 was no ordinary year. It was a web of interlocking secrets, intersecting technologies, and unexplained forces. Families were left with fragments of information, pieces of correspondence, and the unnerving suggestion that their loved ones had been drawn into a lattice of operations far beyond ordinary understanding. The human cost was both visible and invisible, measured not only in the lives lost, but in the psychic toll exacted on those still alive to observe, analyze, or endure the weight of unanswerable questions. As the last communications from the Barbel faded, analysts noticed yet another thread. The coordinates tied to the submarine's disappearance overlapped with zones previously associated with unusual aerial phenomena, including unidentified lights observed in the northern hemisphere weeks prior. Reconstruction suggested a chain reaction in which events in the Arctic and South Atlantic were mirrored across hemispheres, mediated by a combination of electromagnetic interference, human manipulation, and unknown environmental factors. Witnesses in both regions reported phenomena simultaneously, creating a network of perception and anomaly that could not be easily dismissed. The final reports, heavily redacted, yet leaking glimpses of the full narrative, framed the Barbel's disappearance as a node in a larger lattice of Cold War mysteries. Underwater detonations, unexplained lights, and anomalies in navigation were linked to prior high-altitude tests, ghost ships, and technological exchanges across oceans. The evidence hinted at invisible hands orchestrating or at least observing events in ways that intertwined engineering, espionage, and phenomena still poorly understood. The convergence of human, mechanical, and environmental factors created a suspense-laden pattern that would reverberate through intelligence archives for decades. And just as analysts began to map these connections, tracing a lattice from the South Atlantic through Cape Canaveral to the Arctic, an unexpected testimony emerged from Hollywood, whispered in confidential notes. Someone else saw those lights from their own backyard. The statement, cryptic yet precise, suggested that the lattice of observation, interference, and anomaly was not confined to military or scientific domains, but extended into civilian life, hinting that the invisible forces shaping 1959's events had permeated spaces far beyond official purview, reaching ordinary witnesses whose accounts, once dismissed, now carried unanticipated weight. The night George Reeves died carried a stillness that belied the storm of intrigue swirling just beneath the surface. Hollywood had long whispered about the pressures weighing on the actor who had become Superman for millions, the bright smile and unwavering moral compass that captivated audiences, masking a life increasingly entangled in shadows few could imagine. On that night, June 16, 1959, Reeves was found in his bedroom, a gunshot wound to the head, the official report quickly labeled a suicide. Friends and colleagues struggled to reconcile the cheerful man they knew with the violent, sudden end. Yet, for those willing to look closer, inconsistencies in the evidence, the angle of the bullet, the position of the weapon, the absence of fingerprints on key surfaces, hinted at a far darker truth. Something about the scene defied the simplicity of self-inflicted tragedy, suggesting instead a carefully orchestrated act designed to remove him from a narrative he had been drawn into without fully realizing it. Weeks earlier, Reeves had been subpoenaed to testify in a case involving aerospace contracts tied directly to Cape Canaveral. Details remained classified, yet whispers of clandestine meetings, hush money arrangements, and technology transfer scandals had begun circulating within Hollywood's most discreet circles. Reeves, charming and socially connected, had unwittingly become a bridge between entertainment, military contracting, and technological espionage. A casual observer might have dismissed the intersections as coincidence, yet for those tracing the threads linking Operation Argus, the Coyita, Cape Canaveral's destroyed rockets, and the missing bar bell, Reeves's name appeared with unnerving frequency in internal memos. Notes suggested he had attended meetings where engineers, government agents, and contractors discussed projects that intersected with missile guidance, nuclear testing, and electromagnetic anomalies, all subjects of extreme sensitivity and potential danger if leaked. The night of his death, Reeves had a dinner party. Records later revealed the guest list included names that seemed innocuous on the surface: studio executives, friends, and a handful of technicians whose work had been connected to aerospace projects. One name in particular caught the attention of investigators reviewing declassified files decades later, a technician who had been linked directly to the Cape Canaveral blast. That single connection transformed what appeared to be a social gathering into a nexus of espionage and silent manipulation. Had Reeves realized the implications of what he had overheard, or what he had been asked to observe? Or had he simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a witness too knowledgeable to remain alive? Further complicating the picture was Reeves's personal correspondence, which suggested he had been preparing to disclose troubling information. Letters, scribbled notes, and diary entries hinted at growing unease with both studio management and unknown parties involved in technology contracts. He had referenced conversations with men in gray suits and numbers that didn't add up, cryptic but unmistakable to anyone trained in reading between lines. The implication was that Reeves had stumbled into a web of military-industrial collusion, a network where film, finance, and national defense intersected in ways designed to keep the public ignorant and those on the periphery carefully controlled. The more researchers pieced together, the more Reeves's death seemed less like an isolated incident and more like a calculated removal from an equation too volatile to leave unchecked. Mob involvement theories began to circulate almost immediately, though mainstream coverage treated them as sensationalist gossip. Yet, internal memos suggest organized crime had long-standing interests in the very aerospace contracts Reeves was set to comment upon. Connections between contractors, subcontractors, and labor unions operating within Cape Canaveral's orbit were murky at best, yet significant at worst. The idea of Reeves as collateral damage, an unintended witness silenced to prevent leakage of sensitive operational details, was not beyond plausibility. Each detail, the bullet's trajectory, the inexplicable movements in his apartment, the presence of the technician, added layers of suspense, transforming the narrative into a web of intertwined risks, secrets, and clandestine oversight. Eyewitnesses in the building surrounding Reeves' apartment reported seeing unidentified vehicles parked in unusual configurations, lingering longer than socially normal, lights flickering in patterns that suggested surveillance rather than accident. Neighbors later recalled the sense of tension, subtle but omnipresent, as though the entire block had become a silent theater for invisible actors. Intelligence reports from the period indicate that such measures were standard protocol when monitoring individuals who had become inadvertent nodes in classified networks, especially those bridging Hollywood's influence with military-industrial operations. Reeves, a man of fame and celebrity, may have been viewed as a liability precisely because he had access to conversations, gatherings, and documentation that intersected with sensitive operations. Forensic analysis, conducted decades after the event, introduced further anomalies. Ballistics experts revisited the trajectory of the bullet and the position of the firearm, concluding that the angle suggested the shot could have been fired from a position not directly accessible to Reeves, raising the possibility of an external actor delivering a precise, undetectable strike. Fingerprint records, while inconclusive, contained subtle smudges that suggested hurried handling, a touch of panic, or perhaps intentional misdirection to obscure identity. Medical records of the time, still partially classified, referenced inconsistencies in the wound pattern, evidence that could not be easily reconciled with a self-inflicted gunshot. These details, when layered upon the context of Reeves's subpoena, his dinner guests, and the overlapping web of aerospace anomalies, produced a narrative heavy with suspense, paranoia, and psychological tension. The suspense of Reeves's story is amplified by the timing of other 1959 anomalies. Across the South Atlantic and the Arctic, signals intercepted from unidentified sources mirrored wavelengths found in experiments tied to Argus, the Joyita, and Cape Canaveral. The temporal overlap of Reeves's death with these events, combined with the dinner guests' direct connection to Cape Canaveral, suggests a coordinated lattice of operations that was both spatially and temporally precise. Each event seemed to echo or respond to the other, hinting at orchestration by unseen hands capable of influencing outcomes across domains, from submarines and rockets to high-profile civilian witnesses. Then came a detail that tied Reeves's personal tragedy to the broader web of 1959's secrets. The technician who dined with him that night, the same man connected to Cape Canaveral, was later revealed in internal memos to have communicated with naval intelligence about the missing USS Barbell. Every conversation, every movement, every seemingly casual interaction was part of a pattern. It wasn't random. Reeves had been caught at the center of something far bigger than Hollywood, something that stretched across oceans, rockets, and submarines, and he was a witness no one wanted left alive. The implication was chilling. Hollywood, aerospace projects, and military operations were all quietly intertwined, orchestrated in ways that the public would never see. One man's death suddenly made sense in this hidden network of influence and secrecy. Reeves's smile, his charisma, the persona of Superman. It had shielded him from view, but not from those who monitored the flow of classified knowledge. He had become a nexus, a point where civilian life and covert operations collided, and the consequences were deadly. And then, the haunting image that sealed it. A black and white photo of George Reeves slowly dissolving, fading from his bedroom into a courtroom in Florida. The transition was more than symbolic. It was proof that his life and his death were linked to forces far beyond his understanding. From Hollywood to high-stakes legal battles, from dinner tables to secret memos, the lattice of 1959's shadow operations stretched farther than anyone could have imagined. And just as the photo faded completely, a chilling realization hit. This story was far from over. The air in Jacksonville, Florida, that June was thick, humid, and heavy with unease, as though the heat itself conspired with the shadows creeping through the streets. On the night of June 16th, weeks after Reeves's death had rattled Hollywood, another story was quietly unfolding, one that would expose the undercurrents of power, secrecy, and fear running through the state. Betty Jean Owens, a young woman barely out of her teens, had been brutally attacked on a quiet street, the crime so violent and sudden that it left the entire community reeling. The horror of her ordeal shocked the public, but what followed was equally, if not more, disturbing. The trial that ensued moved with a speed so unprecedented it seemed almost mechanical, as though invisible hands were orchestrating every motion of the judicial clock. Witnesses were corralled, statements compiled, and within days the machinery of justice began to hum, not in the careful, deliberate rhythm expected of a case of this magnitude, but in a cadence that suggested someone was racing to finish before truths could surface. As the days progressed, irregularities began to appear. Court documents vanished from files, leaving only partial transcripts that hinted at the existence of evidence never publicly addressed. Jurors, sworn to secrecy and yet frightened by subtle warnings from unknown sources, reported feelings of intense pressure, whispers in hallways that seemed to come from no one, and a pervasive anxiety that shadowed their every move. The official narrative, swift justice for a heinous crime, masked the strange undertones, the sense that the trial was being manipulated from beyond the visible players, that forces with knowledge and power were guiding its trajectory. For anyone watching closely, the pattern was unmistakable. The machinery of law was being bent to serve a narrative, one that protected certain names, silenced certain whispers, and left gaps that would never be explained in public records. Even more troubling were the rumors that began to circulate quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the weeks following the attack. One of the assailants allegedly had ties to an Air Force intelligence unit, a connection that drew the invisible line between local violence and the broader lattice of secret operations already pulsing through 1959. In a year filled with mysterious deaths, vanishing vessels, and covert military experiments, the notion that a civilian crime could intersect with national security was no longer implausible. Those who whispered the connections spoke in hushed tones, pointing to the timing, the speed of the trial, and the pressures applied to witnesses and jurors alike as evidence that someone was intent on keeping the threads of this event tightly controlled, away from public scrutiny. Amid the legal whirlwind, something else began to emerge, one of those small, almost imperceptible anomalies that would later gnaw at investigators' sense of comprehension. Across Florida, civilians began reporting strange lights in the night sky, clusters of shimmering patterns moving with unnatural precision. UFO sightings, they called them, though few dared publish their accounts widely. The timing was uncanny. The flashes appeared almost nightly during the trial, hovering near areas connected to the local Air Force bases and Cape Canaveral, just as engineers and technicians scrambled to repair or recalibrate equipment that had been damaged or destroyed in previous secret tests. For anyone attempting to chart the events of that year, the alignment of these phenomena, the trial, the military projects, the atmospheric anomalies, hinted at coordination on a scale that defied easy explanation, as if something in the sky was monitoring, responding, or perhaps even influencing the terrestrial world below. Neighbors recalled moments when the night air was pierced by strange, pulsating glows, arcs of light that seemed to vanish without a trace. Children, awakened in their beds, whispered about shapes they saw moving silently over rooftops. Adults dismissed these as tricks of heat, hallucinations, or overactive imaginations. Yet, when cross-referenced with the testimony of Air Force personnel and declassified logs decades later, the reports bore an eerie consistency. Objects, sometimes stationary, sometimes darting across the horizon, matched electromagnetic signatures recorded during Cape Canaveral tests, suggesting that either the technology itself produced these visual phenomena, or that some unknown observers were tuning their presence to coincide with both human events and experimental outcomes. The trial itself became a microcosm of the tension suffusing the state. Courtroom doors clicked and clanged with unusual frequency. Reporters noticed shadows where none should have been. And even the simplest procedures, from jury selection to witness examination, felt charged with invisible weight. Prosecutors moved aggressively. Defense attorneys floundered under strange pressures, and the victim's family navigated a maze that seemed half judicial, half clandestine. Observers would later note that while the case was officially one of swift justice, the unspoken undertones, the vanished records, the threatened jurors, the odd intersections with military personnel, hinted at a far deeper story, one that brushed up against the same lattice connecting Reeves, Cape Canaveral, Operation Argus, and the vanished USS Barbell. And then there was the final, chilling layer of synchronicity. As the court delivered verdicts and the city exhaled from the tension, the strange lights persisted, hovering near Florida's coastlines, moving in calculated arcs over neighborhoods, skimming the horizon over Cape Canaveral, a silent and watchful presence. Those few who dared track the phenomenon noticed that the timing of the sightings coincided with shifts in military operations, and even with key moments in the trial. Signals intercepted decades later suggested communications that matched neither civilian nor known military frequencies, transmissions whose purpose remains uncertain but whose timing cannot be ignored. The implication for historians, investigators, and casual observers alike was terrifying. Even in moments of apparent closure, unseen forces were shaping outcomes, monitoring human activity, and intersecting with justice in ways that blurred the line between natural events and deliberate orchestration. As newspapers chronicled the verdict, one headline in particular caught the eye, seemingly ordinary yet layered with foreboding significance. Words printed in stark black ink, justice delivered swiftly. Hid within them the echoes of a much larger narrative, a story of influence, pressure, and the manipulation of outcomes by invisible hands. And as the ink seemed to bleed into memory, dissolving from the page into the wider world, the scene began to shift. The focus of attention moved north, across state lines and legal jurisdictions, toward the case of Sam Shepard, a trial equally shadowed by rumor, coercion, and mysterious pressures. The transition was seamless, almost imperceptible, as if history itself had arranged the sequence, linking the brutal swiftness of one trial to the prolonged, enigmatic retrial of another, all under the watchful gaze of forces unseen, yet palpably present. The conclusion of the Betty Jean Owens case left questions far outweighing answers. Why did some details vanish from the record? Why were jurors threatened? Whispers of coercion lingering long after the verdict. And how could the strange lights in the Florida sky, seemingly coinciding with both the trial and Cape Canaveral experiments, be dismissed as coincidence? Across decades, researchers have pieced together fragments, a missing page here, a declassified log there, eyewitness accounts, and subtle traces in government memos. Every fragment points to the same underlying truth. 1959 was a year when events on the ground and phenomena in the sky intertwined, shaping and constraining human lives in ways ordinary observers could barely comprehend. The cliffhanger comes as the Florida headline dissolves completely, fading not into calm, but into the courtroom of Sam Shepard, Another story of tragedy, obsession, and the uncertain hand of unseen influence. The audience is left with a chilling sense that these events are not isolated. Each crime, disappearance, and anomaly is part of a lattice of secrecy and control, stretching from Hollywood to the South Atlantic, from Cape Canaveral to the deep oceans, a lattice whose final patterns remain hidden, yet whose consequences continue to ripple across decades. The retrial of Sam Shepard had already gripped the nation with its combination of tragedy, controversy, and the shadows of suspicion that seemed to stretch far beyond the courtroom walls. For many, the case was a simple story of a doctor accused of murdering his wife. Yet, for those who had followed the events of 1959, Submarines, the missing submarines, the secretive Cape Canaveral experiments, the mysterious deaths of witnesses and technicians, and the eerie aerial phenomena, the Shepard case took on a far more sinister dimension. The atmosphere in the courthouse was heavy, laden with tension, every gavel strike resonating not only with legal authority, but also with the weight of invisible eyes watching, listening, calculating. It was in this charged environment that one witness, whose testimony had been considered pivotal, disappeared entirely from the proceedings, leaving an empty chair and unanswered questions that no official record would ever address. The man's death was abrupt and unexplained. No autopsy was conducted, and official records simply noted an unattended demise, leaving the circumstances frustratingly opaque. Phone logs, pieced together years later by investigative researchers, revealed an unsettling network. The witness had maintained regular communication with one of George Reeves's dinner associates, the Cape Canaveral technician whose presence had been scrutinized in Part 7. Every call, every brief exchange of coded words, every arranged meeting hinted at coordination, surveillance, and a web of influence that transcended mere coincidence. The realization hit slowly but inexorably. The witness had not merely vanished. He had been removed from the equation, erased from the chain of evidence, his potential revelations forever silenced. As the trial continued, patterns emerged. Researchers noted a sequence of sudden, unexplained deaths among individuals tied to military contracts, aerospace projects, and other clandestine operations. From engineers working on submarine guidance systems to technicians at secret launch sites, the incidents were consistent in their abruptness and totality, leaving behind no traceable motive for violence and no standard procedural follow-up. The scope suggested coordination on a scale that defied conventional logic, a chilling choreography of removal and suppression designed to ensure that no secrets would escape, no unauthorized narrative would take hold. Each event was isolated in the official record, yet collectively they formed a lattice of control, running in parallel with the high-profile cases, trials, and investigations that occupied headlines and public attention. Investigators, both official and private, began to notice the unsettling overlaps. Locations once considered coincidental were revealed to sit along precise vectors connecting Cape Canaveral, the South Atlantic test sites, and even zones associated with the Dyatlov Pass radiation anomalies. Phone communications, cryptic notes, and declassified memos hinted at a network of surveillance and influence that not only crossed state lines, but suggested international coordination. The witness in Shepard's retrial had been more than a passive observer. He had been a node, a point of convergence where American aerospace, military intelligence, and perhaps even foreign operations intersected. His removal signaled that the web of secrecy was far-reaching, that certain truths were deemed too dangerous for any public exposure. Even more unsettling was the timing. The disappearance occurred almost simultaneously with the final phases of Cape Canaveral's rocket tests, coinciding with U.S. Navy operations in the South Atlantic, and, according to declassified intercepts, anomalous Soviet transmissions detected along specific flight paths. Analysts would later speculate that these signals were linked to experimental guidance systems or early reconnaissance efforts, yet the true purpose remained shrouded. In the present, the connection remained clear only in fragments. A telephone number here, a call logged there, a declassified memo, noting that an individual was advised to terminate travel. Across decades, these fragments created a narrative that implied intent, oversight, and a chilling efficiency in silencing potential leaks. The retrial itself continued under a cloud of psychological pressure. Courtroom observers noted that witnesses were unusually nervous, sometimes refusing to speak, their words clipped or guarded. Jurors reported subtle intimidation, the sense of being watched, and unexplained interruptions that would later be documented only in personal diaries and oral histories. The witness's absence created a ripple effect. Testimony that might have challenged the official narrative was truncated, lines of inquiry closed before they could begin, and the legal process itself became a stage upon which unseen forces orchestrated outcomes. To a careful observer, the Shepard retrial was no longer merely a legal proceeding. It was a controlled environment, a pressure chamber in which certain truths could be carefully filtered or completely suppressed. As patterns of sudden death and suppression continued, investigators began to look beyond U.S. borders. Signals intercepted by U.S. intelligence suggested an eerie echo across the Atlantic into Soviet space programs and experimental operations. Technical analysts studying Luna 1, launched that very year, noted anomalies in telemetry data and trajectory reports, subtle deviations that suggested monitoring or interference. The overlapping timelines of American rocket tests, unexplained submarine activity, and Soviet orbital experiments hinted at a transnational chessboard, one in which witnesses, engineers, and contractors became pawns, removed when their presence threatened to expose underlying strategies. The implication was stark. The operations of 1959 had global reach, and the consequences of observation were immediate, and in some cases, fatal. By the time the courtroom drama of Sam Shepard reached its conclusion, the scale of the hidden narrative had begun to emerge. The missing witness, the pattern of deaths among those tied to military contracts, the sudden vanishing of records, and the mysterious aerial phenomena all aligned into a lattice of power and control that seemed beyond the capability of any single agency. Connections spanned Hollywood, Cape Canaveral, secret naval operations, and even Soviet orbital experiments. The very act of observing, recording, or witnessing placed individuals at risk, and the lesson was enforced with meticulous precision. Knowledge was dangerous, truth could be lethal, and silence was mandatory. The climax of Part 9 comes with the haunting overlay of two realities converging. Footage of Luna 1, the Soviet probe, streaking across space, its instruments broadcasting data that may have intersected with American intelligence operations, plays alongside the audio of a U.S. officer's voice, stating quietly but unmistakably, "They hit something out there." The words hang in the air, simultaneously confirming and obscuring the truth, leaving the audience with the unshakable sense that what had been witnessed and what had been silenced reached beyond terrestrial conflicts into a broader, more mysterious theater of activity. It is a convergence of observation, experimentation, and secrecy that spans oceans, atmospheres, and even the vacuum of space, leaving the story suspended between revelation and enigma. And in that final moment, as Luna 1 continues its silent trajectory, as the voice lingers over the recording, and as the audience absorbs the staggering pattern of deaths, disappearances, and clandestine operations, a chilling understanding takes hold. 1959 was not merely a year of isolated tragedies or technological breakthroughs. It was the nexus of a hidden war, one in which human lives were the currency, secrets were the prize, and the consequences extended from Hollywood to the heavens themselves. The lattice of control, manipulation, and deadly precision remained in motion, leaving viewers with the haunting certainty that every event, every death, and every suppressed testimony was part of a single terrifyingly coherent design. The world seemed to hold its breath in the final months of 1959, a year already heavy with vanishings, explosions, and whispered secrets that stretched across continents and oceans. From the snow-choked peaks of the Urals to the balmy streets of Florida, from the roiling South Atlantic to the silent vacuum above Cape Canaveral. Invisible threads bound events in a lattice of secrecy, manipulation, and danger. Those who looked too closely, who asked too many questions, or who glimpsed too far beyond the curtain paid the price in ways that were swift, deliberate, and often permanent. The Dyatlov Pass hikers, lost to the frozen wilds, had been the first silent signal, their bodies found with baffling injuries and radiation traces that defied explanation. The official Soviet narrative closed the case within days, but decades later, declassified memos suggested an entirely different story, that an unknown presence had been tested, observed, and perhaps engaged, and that the echoes of that engagement reverberated across the globe, touching seemingly unrelated events with an invisible hand. Operation Argus in the South Atlantic, ostensibly a high-altitude nuclear test to explore electromagnetic phenomena, had left traces not only in the instruments of the Navy, but in the sky itself. Personnel reported equipment failures, electromagnetic pulses, and eerie luminescent flashes that seemed to move with intention. Soviet ships had been spotted nearby, ostensibly studying the tests, but intercepted communications suggested they were tracking something far more enigmatic than a simple nuclear detonation. Radiation readings from the Dyatlov Pass, the disappearance of the USS Barbel, and even the strange abandonment of the MV Joyita appeared to converge along this invisible vector, a spine of anomalies linking high-latitude experiments, undersea detonations, and maritime vanishings into a coherent yet terrifying pattern. Each event alone was strange, but viewed together, they hinted at an orchestrated sequence of observation, experimentation, and concealment whose full scope remained beyond comprehension. Meanwhile, the American aerospace programs at Cape Canaveral were not merely testing rockets or satellites. They were monitoring, recording, and perhaps even interacting with phenomena that defied conventional explanation. Mid-air explosions, foreign components embedded in test vehicles, and a series of sudden engineered deaths all pointed to infiltration, sabotage, or interference from external forces. The Navy and intelligence communities quietly coordinated, manipulating both information and people to ensure that the patterns remained invisible to the public. George Reeves, silenced in Hollywood, became a footnote in this sprawling matrix. His planned testimony about aerospace contracts abruptly terminated, leaving investigators with only speculation and circumstantial links. The connections between seemingly unrelated deaths, engineers, witnesses, technicians, began to form a lattice of influence that spanned not just states or agencies, but hemispheres. In Florida, the Sam Shepard retrial had highlighted how a single legal proceeding could be shaped, curtailed, and manipulated by forces that were both visible and invisible. Key witnesses vanished or were removed, jurors experienced subtle intimidation, and phone records later revealed ties between participants in the case and the same Cape Canaveral technician linked to Reeves's last hours. UFO sightings coincided with court dates, and declassified logs hinted at signal interceptions and anomalies in communications frequencies. Every thread pointed to the same unsettling conclusion. Knowledge was dangerous, observation was perilous, and human lives were expendable to preserve secrets. What the public saw as isolated events, the death of a star, the vanishing of a sub, the swift closure of a trial, was in fact an interconnected tapestry of experimentation, surveillance, and control. Even the Soviet side of the globe reflected the same intricate web. Luna 1, the first probe to orbit near the Moon, launched with an ostensible scientific purpose. Yet, telemetry anomalies suggested that the Soviets were monitoring trajectories, perhaps intercepting signals, and possibly responding to American tests in the South Atlantic or Cape Canaveral's experimental zone. A U.S. intelligence officer's voice, preserved in recording, quietly noted, "They hit something out there," as if confirming that both nations were engaged not just in open rivalry, but in a shadow game whose true stakes involved forces and phenomena no one could fully explain. The Dyatlov radiation anomalies, the barbell disappearance, and the aerial lights over Florida were all pieces of a puzzle too large, too interconnected, to be understood in isolation. As the final weeks of 1959 unfolded, the human toll of this invisible war became starkly clear. Families were pressured into silence, jurors coerced, technicians and engineers removed with surgical precision. Reports were destroyed, records disappeared, and eyewitnesses were silenced in a way that suggested a ruthless, meticulous orchestration spanning oceans, governments, and clandestine laboratories. Even those who survived were left with fragments, glimpses of strange lights, unexplained equipment malfunctions, cryptic phone calls, and moments of intuition that something larger, something orchestrated, was at work. The lattice of influence extended from the frozen Urals to the southern Atlantic, from the beaches of Florida to Cape Canaveral, from Hollywood studios to the Soviet launch pads, a network of mystery and menace that enveloped the planet itself. The echo of every event resonated across the year. The Dyatlov Pass, initially a tragic hiking accident, became the first anomaly in a chain of phenomena. Operation Argus, framed as a scientific test, suggested unseen objectives. The MV Joyita, found adrift and abandoned, hinted at a hidden exchange or secret observation. Cape Canaveral's rockets and the sudden deaths of engineers revealed that terrestrial and extraterrestrial forces were being tested, monitored, or influenced. George Reeves's silence and Sam Shepard's manipulated retrial demonstrated the reach of power over life and testimony. And Luna 1's flight suggested a convergence of these experiments on a planetary and perhaps cosmic scale. By the time December 31st, 1959 arrived, the world carried the weight of all these convergences, yet nearly everyone remained unaware. The public had seen headlines, arrests, and newsreels, but the true story of vanishings, tests, manipulations, and secret exchanges remained buried beneath layers of official narrative and obfuscation. The final picture was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, a year in which human endeavor, secret military projects, cosmic exploration, and unexplained phenomena collided, creating a lattice of events that was deliberate, precise, and deadly. Those who witnessed, measured, or participated were left either dead, silenced, or forever haunted by what they had glimpsed. And as the year closed, with Luna 1 streaking silently beyond Earth, with Cape Canaveral technicians recalibrating instruments in the wake of inexplicable failures, with survivors of submarines and ships recounting anomalies they could barely explain, the final truth remained. 1959 had been a year in which human curiosity, technological advancement, and cosmic mystery had intersected in ways that no single individual could control, yet which had reshaped the boundaries of what was possible and what was permitted. Across oceans, continents, and skies, the echoes of the year continued, carrying their lessons and their terrors into the decades that would follow. The lattice remained, invisible yet palpable, a reminder that some truths are too vast, too interwoven, and too dangerous to ever be fully revealed, leaving only fragments, whispers, and the lingering, spine-tingling awareness that somewhere, in the shadows of the known and the unknown, the watchful eyes of 1959 still see, still measure, and still influence the unfolding story of humanity. The final curtain falls, not with closure, but with resonance. Every disappearance, every silenced voice, every unexplained phenomenon is part of a network that stretches far beyond the comprehension of its participants, a web of cause and effect that links the frozen Urals, the South Atlantic, Hollywood, Florida, and the heavens above Cape Canaveral into a single, chillingly coherent narrative. The echoes beyond the horizon remind us that some events, once set in motion, cannot be unraveled. They ripple outward in silence, shaping futures, influencing decisions, and leaving humanity with only the fragile knowledge that it exists within forces far larger than any individual and far more mysterious than any record could ever convey.